Alright guys, today we are going to talk about some common running problems and how to fix them. So the first one is a high loading rate. This is super common in a lot of athletes. Typically it happens at lower cadences. You're going to see kind of the stompers. This happens a lot. It's associated with landing out in front of you, no surprise as well. The goal for our endurance races, marathon, any long distance stuff, you're primarily going to want to focus on landing a little closer to your center of mass, regardless of whatever problem we're talking about here. But primarily want to land closer to your center of mass, because anytime you start extending that out in front of you, it's gonna do a couple of different things. The first thing, it's going to cause excessive wear and tear on your joints and muscles. You don't want that, especially for a long distance event. You can kind of get away from it for some of those shorter events, but as you start increasing the time, this becomes more of an issue. A high loading rate plays a huge role in causing stress fractures and soft tissue damage. That's because over time it just keeps wearing and tearing, breaking down, and that impact rate is really high in these types of runners. So you have to be careful here, because if you don't have any of the right muscle structures or muscle balances, then that's going to cause other issues down the road as well. You should be concerned about this. Why you should be concerned about this is decreasing the loading rate encourages a contact point closer to your center of mass, as we just talked about earlier, minimizing excessive lumbar arch as well. If you are reaching out in front of you, typically you're arching your back a little bit as well. You're flaring those ribs out in front of you, and your foot is contacting the ground way far in front of you. And also changing your limb stiffness. You want to run a little bit softer throughout this phase. Correcting this, just like we talked about, we are running a little bit softer here. We are increasing our cadence 5 to 10% at a time, just like you're running mileage. You don't want to increase it too fast over a period of time. Excuse me. Again, increasing this cadence is going to cause your foot to land closer to your center of mass there, which is the key in some of these longer distance events here for most of us. You're going to need to correct your lumbar alignment. Think like a lower cross syndrome. That typically occurs here just because the loading rates are so high. There's no place for your muscles to go if they're not correctly balanced, but the wrong way. So that's going to happen as well. Quick drill that you can do to help you with correcting this higher loading rate is doing the heel lift drill. That's a good cue to get your foot to land closer to you and to use your glute. The next problem today that we're going to talk about is an increased internal hip rotation. Typically this is associated with a lot of IT pain. A lot of people usually get this, so again, it's really common. Anterior knee pain is usually associated with this, and it happens during the stance phase of your running. So that is going to be key for this. If you're out on your run and you're noticing during your stance phase of your run cycle that you have some of that anterior knee pain, this could be your issue right here. So keep that in mind. Why fixing this is important is rotational alignment of your hips should reflect structural alignment. What that means is you should be aligned, hips, knees, ankles, all the way down, all the way up to the shoulders as well. If you're not, something is wrong unless you're structurally built like that. And keep in mind that some rotation is in fact normal. Everybody's going to have a little bit here and there for sure. And if you don't, I'm super impressed, because I've never ever seen that. Excessive mobility in the transverse plane creates mechanics for a number of lower body injuries. So this is pretty much telling us that if you don't fix this, this is going to cause other issues down the road. Typically we see this right around the time where our athletes start to peak right there. If they have not fixed their movement imbalances, we actually won't bring them up to that higher mileage weeks, just because the increase for injury is not worth it at all. Also, creating these bad body mechanics, these bad stride, stance, anywhere in the running phase mechanics, what's going to happen during your long event, because you're going to be going a little bit faster, you're going to be trying to reach a goal, what's going to be happening during your race is when you break down, typically that's when injuries are going to happen, because those muscles are overworked, they're tired, they're going to go to where they want to go now, and that's typically in the bad places. So you have to keep that in mind. Fixing this internal hip rotation, it sounds really simple, but if you're running on a treadmill or anywhere inside with a mirror, you can watch yourself when running, especially your knees when you land. When you land, they should be pointing forward. They shouldn't be waving from side to side. When you land, they shouldn't rotate in towards the midline of your body. And if they are doing that, then there's some problems here. You can also strengthen your hip. You could strengthen your lateral hip extension as well. With doing that, excuse me, with strengthening that hip extension strength, you're going to open up your body to more movement areas, right? You're going to allow for a more natural running stroke right there. Third problem is a quad dominant running, and typically this happens with a lot of tight hip flexors. We usually see this with track athletes when they were younger, and then they move on to endurance athletics. They're going to run the way they've ran for years and years and years, and that leads to issues as well. So we have to work with these athletes to kind of relearn the running technique, because they're used to the 400, 800, the mile, and sometimes even longer events than that, although typically the rate that happens is a little lower. But the tight hip flexors cause your foot to contact excessively in front of you. Think back to our to the first problem that we had in this presentation. This is very, very closely associated with that one. I probably should have put those as one and two now that I'm thinking about it, but that's okay because we're here now. You need to pay attention to this when you are running. And I put this in here, listening to your body. I put that in there because a lot of times athletes, they just know they're in pain and they get back and they'll let us know, hey, that hurt. You're like, okay, tell us what hurt, and they'll tell you. But knowing when it hurts in your running stance is super important, super critical. If you just know that it hurts, that's step one. Where does it hurt and when does it hurt are going to be two huge factors here. Why address this problem? Increasing compression of your patella will lead to increased muscle fatigue of the quads. So essentially what this is saying is this is going to put excessive strain on your patella when your quads get tired. That is not a good thing at all. Think back to our long distance event, our race day individual. When that person's out there and they over fatigue those muscles, bad things are going to happen. Typically an injury, typically a big issue that we have to take a couple of months off for, and that is not why we should be racing. You know, our goal is to have a great time, but our secondary goal should be able to move around okay in the months and weeks after. Having your foot land closer to your center of mass minimizes the arm lever, or the lever arm around your knee, which decreases stress on your knee. This all goes back to, again, the first step here, increasing your cadence a lot of times helps, doesn't solve, but helps this issue a lot. Having that foot land underneath you when you're running helps big time. This is because it theoretically should activate your glutes, your hamstrings, a lot of your posterior muscles on the back side of your body. Doesn't always work, and a lot of times these muscles are turned off, so you do have to do some activating drills and some strengthening for sure. Just don't think that changing where you land on your cadence is going to change everything. Okay, you're going to have to do a little bit of work to fix these issues as well. It's just not a magic fix that happens overnight. This is typically one of the most common cases of knee pain in runners, and it's associated for most people. We're sitting down a lot. We're not actively moving that around. Think about all the times, or all the amount of the time that you're sitting down or in that flex state for your hip flexor. Now you're going to say, okay, if I run 10 hours a week, it's going to counteract that. There's no way. There's no way. So you have to be on it with your stretching, foam rolling, and just opening up that hip flexor to allow you to move properly. Because we're going to sit more than we are in that extended state for sure. But the more time you can get that hip opened up properly, the better your running is going to be. Fixing that quad dominant movement, again, mobility. Tight runners must increase their hip extension through stretching hip flexors. Exactly what I just said. You got to open up those hips big time. That is going to be one of the big keys to unleash your running power and speed throughout any phase of your training and racing. Increasing those hip opening drills, hip opening stretches, all of that is going to be great. Going back to what I was talking about a little earlier on the activation front, getting the glutes and the posterior muscles to fire through activation exercises beforehand is going to be key. And a lot of times when you first start these activation drills, like clamshells, for instance, when you do these, or monster walks, when you do these, your quads might be firing, and that's okay initially. But as the weeks and months go by, if you're doing these activation drills and your quads are still firing, and your posterior muscles are not, then we have to go back to the drawing board and we got to figure out what's going on here. Because if your quads are that turned on that over the course of months and months and months, doing these posterior activation drills before we go out for a run, then something else is going on, and that's not good. An example of this is the chair of death squats before you run. Super, super popular exercise, but it's super important. Super important. Changing up your gait style. So instead of like the track runners, they're typically just all anaerobic. They're all speed. It's over and done with in less than 3 minutes. Okay. Instead of driving your knee up and forward with your hip flexors, you want to use your hamstrings and your glutes to lift the heel up behind you after you extend. Picture it like a hamstring curl in the air. That's going to really help things out. The next problem, we have the lower crossed syndrome. These postural patterns cause the inability of deep core muscles, glutes, hamstrings, and intrinsic foot muscles to fire properly. So in a nutshell, this is very similar to the upper crossed syndrome if you're familiar, but it's just on the lower half of you. Think knock knees, weak glutes. Typically glutes are inactive and hamstrings don't fire at all. What you're going to get with this is an overactivation of the lumbar erectors, the hip flexors, and the calves. So if you're going on your runs and you typically feel pain in these areas and these areas only, then you know that something else is going on. And a couple ways to counteract this, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But fixing the issue, you need to cue into your lumbar neutral when standing. So before we even go any further, you can do this while looking in a mirror just standing there. So if you're standing around talking to people or just standing at your job, whatever, do a mental check and see what's going on with your back, with your pelvis, what's happening there. And then when you actively get that under control, then you can move to walking, picturing that same position that you were getting into. As you get more and more and more, you start walking. After that, you can do some running drills with that, and eventually you're going to move into running. So I've written progressive here. Obviously, you're going to take it from the very basic approach. Imagine you're a little kid, and then you're going to progress that, progress it. Keeping your pelvis neutral and dropping the sternum forward just enough so your weight is felt in the midfoot. So I wrote this down here because a lot of times athletes, when they stand or run or whatever, they oftentimes feel the pressure only in their heels, or majority of the time in their heels. And this goes back to when we're just standing around. See if you're standing up, if you need to slide forward just a little bit to move that pressure up on your midfoot. If you're just on the heels, then you know bad things are going to happen. And you need to maintain this position when terrain changes. I wrote train here, it's a misspelling, but when terrain changes as well, you got to maintain that position the entire time. Next problem here is a wide or a narrow base of support. What is this? It is a deviation from lateral or lateral to medial, and it places excessive forces on the runner and joints that they are requiring to stabilize. So imagine you see a runner that is landing in a line. When you see them, you look at them from the front and they're running towards you. They're stepping and their next foot will land right in front of the foot that's on the ground. Inversely, a wide base of support, you're going to have the runner who's landing excessively wide. And we'll tackle the first one, the narrow one right here. When you do that, a lot of times you'll see the knees, the hip, the ankle kind of rotate outwards away from the runner. If you're landing wide, oftentimes you'll see the ankle collapse, you'll see the knee collapse, and you'll see the hip internally rotate a little bit here. So obviously that's not good, and you need to change it by addressing your hip and core stability here. So that's a couple of these corrective exercises, activations before, and even when you're not running, getting into the weight room and activating those hip and core stability muscles to allow yourself to land in the proper direction and stabilize you as well. I wrote the New York City Marathon here because there's a couple of years ago during the women's race, you could definitely see this problem. There was a woman landing excessively wide, only on one side, and every time she would land, you could see the ankle collapse and the knee would collapse in a lot. And just like we talked about earlier, you can kind of get away with that stuff for a little while, but as your race progresses and your intensity increases, those stabilizing muscles are going to fatigue out way before that race finishes. So bad things are going to happen as well. Other muscles are going to take over, and that's when bad things happen and injuries are caused. So keep that in mind. I'll try to link up a video of what I saw earlier, but just for a mental cue. How to fix this for a wider runner? Kind of go on a track, or you can do this on a road, like a straight road. You can kind of push that runner closer to this line and force them to land on that line as well. What that's going to do is that's going to move them in. That's going to give them a visual cue. The only problem with this one is oftentimes you'll see people moving away from that line, or they'll be right up on it. So then they're going back to the first problem of landing with one foot right in front of the other, and that's not good either. So this should be a progressive thing, something that you need to work on a little bit. Think small changes instead of super large changes. And then over time, that will come back around, and then it'll be just ingrained in your brain, and you won't have to think about it at a certain point. To cue a narrower stance, you're going to do the exact opposite of what I just said with that line on the road or a track, something that you can see or have that visual cue that you can land on right there. You're just going to push that runner a little further away from that line to allow them to get that visual cue. And you could do some videotaping with either of these as well, just to give the athletes some feedback there. But the bottom line is they have some instabilities or some structural things that are compromising their running stroke, and you need to address that and change it. Some other things that you can do here is running in the mirror. A lot of gyms or a lot of home treadmills have a mirror set up in front of them. If you don't, I highly, highly recommend it. And you can just check in with yourself in that mirror and see, okay, where are my knees tracking? What's going on here? Where's my foot landing? Is it landing excessively close? Are my heels rubbing all the time? Are my heels rubbing on my calves? Some visual cues there. You can run next to someone. We do this a lot for people who are running excessively wide. What this does is this pushes them in. You can just run shoulder to shoulder, and that helps big time. Another one right here is your buddy checks. Just having someone watch you. You don't always have to videotape. I know it gets old and boring after a while, but if you're running with a friend, have them stand at the end of the track and watch you run towards them, or a field or a road, anything. And just have your buddy check in and say, hey, are my feet landing narrow? Are they landing too wide? What's going on? Can you just watch my right foot, my left foot? And they'll tell you honestly. If they're your friend, they'll tell you honestly. And then the biggest one is just fixing your imbalances if it's not a structural, skeletal thing. Your imbalances are going to drive these issues here, and no matter what it is. And addressing it first is key, identifying it, and then going in and actively changing what your body is doing, whether that be stretching some areas, rolling, strengthening, activating those areas before you run. All of that is going to be key. Next one up here is the medial tibial stress syndrome, otherwise known as shin splints. Chances are, if you had a history of running, you've experienced this at some point. You come back in and you feel pain right on the front of that shin or right underneath on the inside of your leg, in between your calf and that shin bone right there. This is, it's not fun. It's not fun. A lot of times this is driving from a collapsing of that ankle when you land. So when you land on the ground, if your foot excessively drops in, people with flat feet or really high arches really got to worry about this. They got to be careful, because if you're flat, you're already rolling in all the time and you're putting excessive strain on there. And if you're really high arched and you don't have that arch strength or that big toe strength, your foot's just going to drop, and the same thing's going to happen as your flat-footed friend. So you need to fix this, because it's going to cause an injury and it's going to force you to take time off. I guarantee it. There are very few people that run through or can run through shin splints, and you are probably not one of those people. So if you are having this, let's address it, let's fix it, let's iron out some of the mobility issues, let's strengthen and stabilize that ankle. And sometimes it can be knee related, but it all goes back to identifying what's going on in your running mechanics. If we can have a video, if you can have a buddy check or someone let you know what's going on, internally rotating, whatever, but a lot of times it is related to that foot collapsing. And our endurance athletes, since they're doing extended period of time runs, a lot of times this affects them when there's a ramp up in training. They survive the base phase, like in the winter time, and then once you get through that, you start to increase some of your mileage and build that base a little bit stronger. You start doing some more speed stuff, and a lot of times that is where we will find this issue happening. Or ironically, a couple of weeks before your big event, right around your peak week area, it can happen there. It can happen a week or two afterwards. But a lot of times that is another hot spot. So those are the big two areas. The last area where this happens is if you've taken a lot of time off from working out or strength training or just moving in general, and you jump right back into it, this aggressive startup is another thing that can cause a lot of these issues right here. So when you're starting up, or when you're ramping up your mileage, or when it gets to right around peak time, you got to address these areas. You got to roll out, stretch out. You got to do some stabilizing, some strengthening. Not a ton if you're in that peak phase, but because theoretically you've done it all the way up to your lead up, but there still needs to be some stability work in there. Fixing this, I should have just rotated the slide. We're going to talk about a lot of the other things. One of the easiest things you can do, a lot of times this happens with the more narrower stanced people. You can widen that stance just a little bit, so you contact the ground a little further away from you. Again, think millimeters, not inches. And this only really works if you are going all the way over to the right over here, if you strengthen your big toe and your arch. Because if you widen it, you're going to have a stronger base of support, because if you're in, you can even do this when you're sitting. You go a little bit further out. You can even go like a foot, just to over-exaggerate it a little bit. The area for you to collapse is less, and then you go all the way back to the middle. There's a ton of room for that arch to collapse. Obviously, we're not going to go out a foot. You want your knee in line with that foot, ideally, and your hip. So you don't want to go out excessively wide, but just a little bit. Again, think millimeters here. You can go back to some of the other drills we talked about already, and this is going to fix some of those issues. But again, do not overcorrect here. Do not overcorrect. And I've written here that the wider stance moves to the pressure medial to the ankle joint, and that decreases the demand of the muscles working inside of the shin from being overworked. So if you have this pain on the outside, you got to do the exact opposite. Another thing that you can look at right here is switching your shoes. A more minimally constructed shoe helps move that pressure more towards the inside of your foot there instead of on the outside, which is, again, you land on your outside and then you collapse in, right? And then your knee has to do a whole bunch of stabilizing. Your ankle's got to catch up. And a lot of times that leads to issues right in there. So changing your shoe to I don't want to say more neutral, but changing your shoe to one with a little less material in it is going to help you a little bit more. It's going to activate some more of those oftentimes foot muscles that are shut down because we have big clunky shoes, and that inhibits a lot of the foot muscles from firing properly. And over time, like we talked about, when you increase your mileage, or right when you get around your peak mileage for your training cycle, a lot of times that comes into play big time. And the last thing I want to talk about with your shoes, if you haven't changed your shoes all season long and you're landing on the outside of your foot, that tread, that pattern underneath your foot is going to wear more than the inside, obviously, because you're landing there, you're putting all your pressure, all that force is generating when you strike the ground on that outside of your foot. So you're going to have an even bigger collapse as those shoes get worn out. That is oftentimes a reason why people don't tell you to change your shoes, but you should change your shoes when that stuff starts to happen because of the issues of collapsing in big time. And you're going to have some shock absorption issues as well, but the foot collapsing inward and your inability to stabilize that joint right there is going to cause way more of the issues. So that is why you need to change your shoes, and when it's time to get new ones, do not wait, because other injuries will happen. I think this is one of the last issues that we're going to talk about, and this is Achilles tendonitis. Again, super common in multi-sport athletes. A little bit more for the runners who are doing excessive miles, really, really big miles, but chances are, if you've been around the running game for long enough, you or someone you know has had the Achilles tendonitis. And let me tell you, from a firsthand experience, it is not fun. It is not fun. But the reason that this kind of comes about is when you are absorbing the energy in the ground, think like right when you strike, instead of you absorbing that, you're trying to generate force. So you're coming at it a little too aggressively, and you kind of need to relax a little bit more, like think a second. And that's probably even too long, because at that point, that part of your run stroke will already be past you. So if you think a second, you're going to probably react a lot faster, but you just delay this process and allow your body to absorb that energy, right? And then transfer it into force or power after that. The reason, one of the biggest reasons why you need to address this issue, this super common thing, increasing power generation of the gastrocsoleus muscle complex at contact causes a strain distribution problem in the Achilles that causes a chronic imbalance. So a lot of the other ones, they do create a lot of issues, and if they go on long enough, it becomes harder to fix. But this is one problem that once it starts happening, it's really hard to counteract this, and oftentimes you do need to take time off to recover this. Just like the shin splints, very, very few people are running through the Achilles tendonitis, and if they do, they are not going to have a fun time after their big race, depending on how much time they pushed through it. You don't want to do that. But going back to the addressing it, generating the gastrocsoleus at contact causes a strain distribution problem. What that means is your muscles are working in areas where they shouldn't be, right? You're taking all that load, that power distribution from the gastroc and putting it into the Achilles, right? And you can even look now, yeah, the Achilles is a powerful tendon, sure, powerful, but you don't want it driving the majority of your work, because if you do, you're going to get Achilles tendonitis for sure. Oftentimes, an unstable foot or ankle kind of worsens the situation, and that is because you place a much higher load through that unstable joint, right? This kind of goes back to the shin splints that we were talking about earlier with the ankle. This unstable joint is a huge contributing factor to a lot of issues, a ton of issues. That's why you need a video, you need to communicate, say what's going on, watch yourself every now and again, do little checks here and there, just to be sure nothing's going wrong. Fixing this, increasing medial or lateral stability. This can go up the whole chain. So what I mean by that is fixing that back and forth stability Because if you have that weak ankle joint, right, the next thing that's going to catch it is that Achilles, and then the next thing that's going to catch it is that knee. And this, you can just work this problem all the way up: ankle, knee, hip, and even shoulder up here. So just work it up the whole chain. That's what I meant when I said that there. Something you could do here is a medial and lateral, standing on a lax ball on your foot. You can put that lax ball like on the outside, on like the palm of your foot on the outside, and just stand on that. You can also do it on the inside, right under your arch. You'll probably get a nice little arch release from that as well, which is closely related. A little plantar right in there, probably very closely related to the Achilles, just because other things have to activate to take over and recover from this improper generation of force at the wrong time. You can also do the lax ball on the big toe. I will warn you, you need to work your way up to that. Start off with the towel, a little bit bigger object, and work your way up. And a lot of people don't even make it up to that lax ball underneath that big toe. So don't feel like you have to get there. You have to get there. If you're feeling a great stretch from a towel, the little burrito stretch, then just stick with that. Stick with that until you're not feeling a stretch anymore from that. And then work your way up a little bit bigger. Maybe you get a little bit bigger of a towel. It's maybe 1/2 centimeter thicker to allow a little bit bigger of a stretch. And just work your way up. It's just like training. You know, stretching is just like training. I wrote here a wall running drill. And what you're going to do is you're going to stand about a couple feet away from a wall, put your hands up on the wall, and relax your feet. Relax that heel and just allow you to kind of sink in. Ideally, you'd be doing this before you have Achilles tendonitis. After, it becomes a little bit different of a conversation, but before, allow your heels to relax a little bit. And then you're going to slowly, just like before with our standing, walking, or our standing drills, walking, running progression, you're going to do the exact same thing. You're just going to stand there and see where your pelvis, your back, your hips, everything are in relation to everything, and see where your heel is. Is it relaxed? Are you up? Can you get it down without forcing it? And if not, then you know, okay, this is one of my big problems. It's probably a flexibility issue here. Then once you get comfortable there, you start to see a little bit of improvement. You start to move into just some, not even marching, just lifting your leg up and holding it in that runner position up against the wall, and see what happens to that foot on the ground. Are you rolling out? Are you collapsing in? Before you even think about going onto the palm of your foot, before you even think about doing that, are you rolling out? Are you collapsing in? What's happening with my foot? And then once you identify what's happening with your foot, if anything, then you can go up to your knee. What's happening with my knee? Is it collapsing? Does it have to point laterally, point out to the side to help get me in this position? If so, we need to address some hip flexor instabilities. Maybe your glute's not firing. What's happening there? After you identify this on both sides, it's a big process, identifying this on both sides, then you can move into more of a march. Again, this is not going to happen over a session. It's not going to happen over a week. This is a progression type deal. After you get comfortable with marching, you can speed it up into a light jog fashion. Then you can speed it up into your normal running form right here after you get to that point. But keep your ankles nice and loose, and see what happens, because I guarantee you, if your ankle is firing, you're going to get a totally different response looking down. And if you're relaxed, that's what's happening out on your run, especially towards the later stages of your longer runs, or say it's a heavy week. That's what's happening. And you can counteract all those things by fixing your imbalances and knowing what's happening. So bottom line, be aware of what's happening and work your way up the chain. So that are all the tips that I have for you today. If you have any questions or comments for me, leave them in the comment section down below. You can also reach me at my email address or phone number on the next screen. So let me know if you want to talk about anything else, and I will see you guys later.